crossbow is the quintessential medieval weapon. Seeing its peak of popularity in Europe between the 12th and 15th centuries, it was nonetheless used somewhat globally in different shapes and sizes from the Age of Antiquity up until today. The basic crossbow consists of 3 parts: the stock, lath, and lock. The stock is the wooden body used to hold all the pieces together. The lath, also known as a prod in the modern day, is the bow mounted upon the stock, and the lock is used to hold the bow after it has been drawn, and then release it at the pull of the trigger. To use the crossbow, the lath is drawn until the lath string is secured onto the nut. The nut is a round block with a notch at the bottom, and a hook at the top for holding the string. The tension of the string was to pull the hook forward and release the string, but the nut is kept in place by the trigger, which presses up into the bottom notch, and is kept in that position by the pressure of a spring. A projectile is then placed in the groove in the top of the stock, just before the string. These projectiles were usually short arrows or darts called bolts or quarrels. When the target is picked, the shooter pushes the trigger, overpowering the spring, pushing the nut forward, releasing the string, and launching the bolt. A much more simple mechanism was the rising peg system. The string is drawn back into a slot in the stock where it rests upon a peg. The trigger, when pushed, forces the peg to rise, pushing the string out of the slot and forward. The system was only feasible with bows of a relatively light draw weight. Draw weight is the amount of force necessary to draw the bow, which is also indicative of its power. This is the basic crossbow design. Naturally, there were an incredible amount of variants. The laths could be made from different materials, there were different lock systems, some were even designed to shoot different projectiles. And some could even shoot multiple projectiles at once, or even repeatedly, like an early submachine gun. All of these variants will be given some attention, but firstly, why would you even use a crossbow? It has long been a point of contention of whether the crossbow is superior to its progenitor, the regular bow. The crossbow is commonly cited as being more powerful than the bow, but there were many types of bows and many types of crossbows. A late medieval arbalest with a steel lath, spanned with a pulley mechanism, was many times more powerful than a hunting bow, but for most of history, crossbowmen would have been stuck with a simple wooden or composite lath, which wouldn't have been more powerful than a regular bow, and certainly not more than a famous longbow. The steel lath wasn't even invented until the 14th century. It depended on superior metallurgy. A more rigid material than flexible steel wouldn't have been able to bend, which is why there weren't any ancient crossbows made out of bronze or iron. Of course, since the lath didn't have to be drawn as far as a regular bow, and not held for extended periods, it could be made heavier. But the drawing distance also lowered its power, so the weight was mostly there to compensate. Therefore, for most of history, power was not a draw of the crossbow's popularity. Instead, the crossbow's advantage lies in its ability to keep a shot ready for longer periods, and its lower skill ceiling. The latter is really the defining factor. Archers require extensive physical conditioning to continuously draw and shoot a bow and arrow. At a Renaissance fair last year, I met a national champion in archery, an older lady actually. And she said she could not fit on the period dress she borrowed from the wardrobe, because her upper back muscles were bigger than the average woman's. That is besides learning how to continuously hit your mark, especially over longer distances. Bowmen were highly skilled, physically capable, and costly. Meanwhile, the crossbow doesn't require much power to span, and you could teach a malnourished peasant to use it at least somewhat effectively in an afternoon. This made it a favorite weapon of poachers, farmers, and rebels, or just anyone who didn't have the time or patience to learn the art of archery. Instead of paying his subjects to continuously practice archery, a lord could just buy a couple of crossbows and maybe have some clay pigeon competitions once a month. And then, as I said, the crossbow could keep its shot over a longer period. Drawing a bow is physically demanding. You're supposed to just draw it and release, and keeping it drawn for more than a few seconds is unfeasible. You were supposed to draw and shoot, draw and shoot. With a crossbow, you could span it, and then keep it so until ready to shoot. This doesn't mean that soldiers or watchmen marched around with loaded crossbows. It would have put unnecessary strain on the lath, risking it snapping and damaging them. Instead, spanning was probably relegated to expected action, just before combat or if going on a high-risk patrol. So it more so meant that you could take a longer aim, just sit there, steady the weapon, time your breathing, wait for the target to stop moving, and shoot when ready. It also meant that you could shoot at a moment's notice, as soon as something moved, instead of having to assume the perfect archer's stance, nock an arrow and draw. Just aim and shoot. This meant that a crossbow was the perfect hunting weapon. It would be a common hunting arm until the 19th century, also owing to the relative silence. It was also a great assassin's weapon. An archer had to stand upright, whereas a crossbowman could kneel or lie prone and wait for his target. Most importantly, the crossbow was an excellent siege and urban combat armament. At any moment, a crossbowman could duck out of a doorway or window, ready to shoot. One of the slight drawbacks was that you couldn't aim low with the crossbow. The bolt would fall out. However, the shooter could keep his thumb on the quarrel, and later on, a metal clamp would be added that kept the quarrel in place, and could still be pushed up by the string. Loading a crossbow takes time, especially if it has a heavier lath that requires a mechanism to span, whereas even the heavier bows can be drawn and shot quite rapidly. But the shots per minute wasn't relevant during siege warfare, which was all about attrition. A months-long affair of the opposing sides continuously whittling down each other's numbers. Rapid shooting was not relevant. It was more important to shoot and get behind cover, or take a careful aim. At this, the crossbow was superior. Ni-ha, YouTube viewers! Even though the crossbow is seen as a quintessential European medieval weapon, it seems to have first appeared in ancient China. Unlike other weapon systems like the trebuchet or gunpowder, the Asian and European crossbows do not appear to have been related. The earliest Chinese crossbow can be dated to 650 BC, based on the finding of a bronze lock. Earlier locks made from organic materials like bone and wood could certainly have existed, but they would have long since perished, and we have no evidence of them. Unlike the European crossbow lock, whose long horizontal trigger was pressed with the whole hand, this lock has a short vertical trigger, designed for use by 1 or 2 fingers. This meant that the lock could be placed further back on the stock, allowing the bow to be drawn further back than its later European counterpart. This crossbow could be drawn a whole 20 inches, whereas the European one was typically only drawn 4 to 5. This made a Chinese crossbow more powerful, without having to make the lath heavier. So the bow was often just that, an ordinary composite bow mounted upon a stock with a mass-produced bronze lock, and issued to large swarms of poorly trained levies. Heavier variants, said to be 3 times as powerful, were allegedly used by elite troops, who spanned them with their hands and feet. The ancient Chinese crossbow is visually distinct from its European counterpart. For a lath, it has a curved and much longer composite bow. It has a modern trigger and trigger guard, and a pistol grip. The lock also has a sighting lever, which both acts to reset the trigger and is used to direct your aim. This variant would survive well into the early modern period, appearing in an evolved form in illustrations from the Ming dynasty. After the Qin dynasty, ruling between 221 and 206 BC, the old crossbow was largely supplanted by a variant with a bow made of multiple strips of bamboo, steamed into shape and held together by hemp. It was weaker and often required poison to be used effectively. In the 11th century, when the Europeans had just begun to use the crossbow, the Chinese had developed sophisticated crossbow tactics. 3 ranks of shooters would rotate between spanning, advancing, and shooting, allowing for a near continuous rate of shot. The most remarkable Chinese crossbow is the repeater, or Shuge Nu, allegedly named after the military strategist Shuge. But there is evidence of this weapon preceding the strategist by decades, if not centuries. Despite its exotic flair, the Shukonu was remarkably simple. Its lock system was basically the same as the simple variant described previously, except that the trigger was a long lever pivoting between the stock and magazine. The magazine housed a stack of 10 or 12 arrows. The bowstring was placed between the magazine and a bar below it. Using the Nu was easy. Pull the lever forward until the notch between the mag and a bar catches the bowstring. Then pull the lever back to span the bow, making a bolt fall before the bowstring. By pulling the lever back a little bit further, the nut pushes up and releases the bowstring. This motion is then repeated until the magazine is empty and needs refilling. Some variants even had a double magazine and could shoot 2 bolts at once. This simple mechanism also meant that the Shukonu was a weak weapon. A heavier lath would be impossible to draw back with the lever. Nor could you shoulder the Nu and take a careful, long-distance aim. It was designed for rapid, close-range volume. To prevent jamming, the bolts were not even fletched, further reducing the long-range accuracy. To ensure stability, you had to steady it against the hip and work the lever in a good rhythm. Even when using it patiently, the Nu could empty a dozen or so bolts within 15 seconds, at the cost of power. Again, poisoned ammunition was one solution. Nonetheless, it became an incredibly popular weapon for mass levies and peasants, who used it for home defense or hunting small game. It was excellent for shooting at a flight of ducks, for example. So the Nu would be used in China as far as the 1950s. Crossbows were an excellent siege weapon, and certain types of enlarged crossbows were a common sight on Asian battlements. They were essentially just an enlarged version of the ancient crossbow, mounted on a carriage, often wheeled. These could shoot multiple arrows at once, releasing a deadly swarm of sharp iron, and often had 1 or even 2 additional bow staves to increase their power. These might be difficult to draw by hand and would require a winch to successfully span. Some were said to require oxen. Depending on the size, they required a crew of up to 10 men. The effort was definitely worth it. Shooting was said to produce a noise like thunder, and it was feared for its armor-piercing power and the range at which it could strike. Accounts testify to a range of between 270 to 500 yards. From China, siege crossbows would spread to its neighbors in Japan, Mongolia, and Vietnam. Each neighbor adapted a crossbow to their own liking. The Japanese designed a version capable of launching stones. The Vietnamese would mount them upon elephants. The Mongols brought the crossbow with them across the steppe, using them to shoot flaming and explosive arrows. The Japanese use of the regular crossbow is interesting, because in the 7th century they did take a great liking to it, both the handheld and siege variant. One of the earliest accounts comes from a naval battle, another scene where the crossbow was excellent. Before the advent of cast iron artillery and line tactics, sea battles were essentially sieges between floating wooden castles. Anyway, the Japanese stopped using the crossbow in favor of mounted archers, largely owing to manufacturing issues. It was last mentioned in 1189. The Greeks and Romans did use a number of weapon systems similar to the crossbow, the ballista and its smaller derivatives, the Scorpio and the repeating Polybius. The difference is that the ballista does not use a bow, but rather 2 separate arms powered by twisted sinew. It uses torsion power instead of tension. But the Greeks did have a siege crossbow called the gastraphete, meaning belly shooter, because the bow was spanned with your belly. The top of the stock held a sliding mechanism with a bronze lock at its end. The slide was brought forward until the hooks on the lock attached to the bowstring. The shooter then placed the bow against the ground and pushed their belly against the crossbow, so that the sliding mechanism was pushed up, and drew the bowstring back. The bottom of the lock had teeth that would latch into notches in the stock, allowing the weapon to be loaded incrementally. When ready to shoot, the bowstring was released by a small trigger mounted on the top of the lock. It doesn't seem certain how common the Gastrafete was. It was first described in the 1st century AD by Heron of Alexandria, who based his description on a lost account from the 3rd century BC. Opinions vary on when the Gastrafete might first have been invented. Some say as early as the 5th century BC. In the Roman world, crossbows appeared as early as the 4th century AD. Known as arcuballista, meaning bow thrower or throwing bow, the exact meaning isn't especially relevant, since it was obvious that the name was more literal. It was a bow or an arch mounted on a stock, and the Romans thought it resembled the ballista. It is, however, a very elusive weapon. Archaeological findings are limited to a bone nut, discovered in 1893, implying that the arcuballista was made entirely of organic materials and would thus have rotted away. So they could have appeared earlier than the 4th century, but this is also the time that it appears in written records and artwork. In the late 4th century, Vegetius wrote how crossbowmen, arcuballistariae, formed up with artillerymen in the line of battle, and how they worked together with regular archers on siege towers to clear the defending ramparts. No indicators are given as to how the arcuballista were used, or how many used it. But we do know for certain what the arcuballista looked like, thanks to a pair of Gallo-Roman hunting reliefs from what is now France. Since the arcuballistas in both reliefs are virtually identical, we can assume this to have been the standard design, at least for hunting crossbows. The arcuballista was sort of a mix between the Chinese design and the later medieval crossbow. It seems to have utilized a rather long bow, which must also have been drawn rather far back into the stock. The nut is definitely of the medieval variant, however, coinciding with the archaeological finding of a Roman bone nut. That only leaves the trigger, since the reliefs only show top views of the crossbows. Some have speculated that it just used the medieval-style horizontal trigger. This would have allowed its use by cavalry, and there is pictorial evidence from around the year 1000 of cavalry using a crossbow identical to the arcuballista, with a horizontal trigger. Others believe that the trigger was in fact the peculiar handle at the back of the stock. The back of the stock would have been hollow, allowing for a rod to horizontally push the nut into place. The rod was attached to the handle, and by drawing it backwards, the nut would release and launch the bow. Owing to its design, it is believed that the arcuballista was fired and spanned from the hip, and that it wouldn't have been especially powerful. Its widespread military application is therefore uncertain, even if some have proposed possible spanning mechanisms, like a sort of leather belt attached to the handle, which would have allowed for heavier bows more applicable in the military. But since the arcuballista barely ever appears in archaeology or written records, it is uncertain how common it was outside of hunting until the Middle Ages. Even though the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the arcuballista persisted in the eastern provinces. Here it re-emerged as a weapon of war much earlier than in the West, and owing to the trigger system, it is certain that the eastern crossbow stemmed from the Roman arcuballista, rather than Chinese variants. The Byzantines seem to have used a regular crossbow called Geryumagana on some occasions, but it doesn't seem to have been especially popular. Instead, their crossbows were primarily relegated to siege weapons and naval warfare, mounted on frames or pedestals, and spanned with the use of winches. Similar siege crossbows were used in the Muslim world, though many of their designs were even more complicated than the Byzantine counterparts, and the Byzantines would take some of their ideas rather than Western ones. Lighter, handheld crossbows would not become common in the East until widespread contact with the West in the 13th and 14th centuries. The crossbow seems to have mysteriously disappeared from Western Europe after the fall of Rome in the 5th century, not reappearing until 5 centuries later. However, owing to the similarity of Roman and medieval crossbow locks, the weapon definitely floated around in some limited use by hunters. In Scotland, crossbows appear depicted on Pictish hunting stones from between the 6th and 9th centuries, seemingly confirming the persistence of the weapon, even if it hasn't survived in written records or archaeology. It doesn't appear in military documentation until the Siege of Senlis in 949, and then again in the Siege of Verdun in 984. The earliest archaeological example is the remains of a small, 20-inch crossbow excavated from Lake Paladru near Grenoble in southeastern France. Interestingly, the Swedish translation of the Jomsvikinga saga describes how crossbows were used by the Norse Jomsvikings at the semi-mythical Battle of Gjøringavager, but I couldn't find any other references to it in the Norwegian or Danish translations, nor in the original Icelandic text. The saga has a lot of versions and translations, so it is uncertain where the Swedish translator got it from, or if he just flat out invented it. The crossbow does not appear to have entered Scandinavia until the 12th or 13th century. They entered the Republic of Novgorod around the same time, spreading throughout what is now northwestern Russia. Of note is that the word crossbow does not appear to have been used in English until the 15th century. Throughout the Middle Ages, most of the Catholic countries referred to it by some variant derived from ballista or arcoballista. These variants were incredibly numerous. One book I read listed 15 different names in Latin, French, and/or English alone. But in English it would have been something akin to arbalist. Other countries had more unique names. In Germany it was called an Armbrust, arm meaning, well, arm, and Brust meaning chest or rib cage. This could either mean that the first German crossbow was shot or spanned against the chest, like the Roman arcoballista, or that the bow resembled a rib cage. So it was a rib cage mounted on an arm. A common Scandinavian name was låsbåge, meaning lockbow, as in a bow with a lock. The Normans were responsible for bringing the crossbow to England. William the Bastard was followed by a troop of crossbowmen, and bolt heads have been excavated from the battlefield of Hastings. The crossbow is often neglected in English history books in favor of the more iconic longbow, even though it was an extremely popular weapon in England before the 14th century advent of the longbow, and existed alongside it. Crossbows in England were used by soldiers, hunters, and hunters of men, assassins. In 1100, the reign of William II came to a close at the end of a murderous arbalist. His son Henry was almost killed by the crossbow of his illegitimate daughter, Juliana. Most famously perhaps was when Richard the Lionheart perished from the gangrene caused by a crossbow bolt in 1199. During the siege of Chalus Castle in France, Richard was amused by the sight of a French defender, Peter Basilius, shooting his crossbow and using a frying pan as a shield. He didn't laugh so hard once he got hit, but he told his men to spare young Peter. They didn't. The most common early medieval crossbow was a simple design, with an organic or metal lock and trigger, and a stock and lath made of wood. These were cheap to manufacture and maintain, and would remain in usage well into later centuries. A Byzantine princess, Anna Komnenos, describes how they were loaded. This instrument of war has to be stretched by lying almost on one's back. Each foot is pressed forcibly against the half circles of the bow, and the hands tug at the bow, pulling it with all one's strength towards the body. An improvement to the crossbow was the stirrup, a metal half-moon mounted on the painful end of the stock, introduced at some point in the 12th century. The stirrup was placed against the ground and the foot inserted through it, allowing the shooter to stand while reloading their crossbow. Whilst the Europeans had metal stirrups, the Mamluks and Chinese used a variant made of cord. Another improvement was the belt and claw, known back then as a baldric. It was a twin pair of hooks attached to the belt around your hip. The hooks were latched under the bowstring, and the crossbowmen pulled up to span the bow. The wooden crossbow was introduced to Anna and the Byzantines by the Crusaders, and she could likewise testify to their power. The missiles do not rebound when they hit a target. In fact, they pierce a shield, cut through a heavy iron breastplate, and resume their flight on the far side. So irresistible and violent is the discharge. An arrow of this type has been known to go straight through a bronze statue, and when shot at the wall of a very great town, its point either protruded from the inner side or buried itself in the wall and disappeared altogether. The unfortunate man who is struck by it dies without feeling anything. So strong is the force of the blow. These crossbows were simple, wooden-lathed weapons, so the cartoonishly powerful description provided by Anna was most likely hyperbole, as was so common in medieval books. These crossbows had a draw weight of between 100 to 175 pounds, which is many times greater than the measly 45 or so of the arqueballista, but still not enough to pierce good armor beyond close distance. Even still, the early crossbow was an effective weapon, perhaps so much so that the Pope famously attempted to ban its use against fellow Christians in 1139, and then again at the turn of the century. This wasn't necessarily a condemnation of the weapon itself, nor of regular infantrymen using it, but rather the violence between good Christian knights. The Pope would much rather prefer it if the crossbow was used against the Muslims, and the Westerners brought the weapon with them on their expeditions to the Holy Land. It was used to great effect at the Battle of Jaffa in 1192. An outnumbered force of crusaders, led by Richard the Lionheart, formed up into a shield wall, protecting a backline of crossbowmen. Since the crossbow had to be loaded while seated, the arballesters operated in pairs, one man aiming and shooting as the other spanned. The line was further isolated by a field of iron tent pegs, certain to cause harm against Saladin's cavalry. After the Saracens had been repelled, Richard led the offensive, the crossbowmen shooting as they advanced. It was a decisive victory, and the final battle of the Third Crusade. Between the 13th and 14th centuries, the crossbow would see major innovations, which would elevate it to a highly powerful weapon. These included new laths and spanning mechanisms, as well as a handful of auxiliary devices. Interaction with the Middle East introduced the Europeans to the composite bow. This was a complex design, consisting of multiple layers of horn cut with grooves, bound together with sinew and soaked in glue. The result was a lightweight and flexible piece that could nonetheless store great amounts of energy, resulting in a draw weight of between 200 to a whopping 600 pounds. Such a powerful bow was near impossible to span by hand, and demanded the development of complex spanning mechanisms. The first to appear was the windlass. It consisted of the double hooks of the belt and claw, and tied to a series of strings tied to a capstan with two handles, attached to a small box. The box was fixed on the end of the tiller, the back of the stock, the hooks under the bowstring, and the handles were then spun to draw the bow until the string reached the nut. The gaffle, or goat's foot, consisted of a curved fork, terminating in a lever, with a hook pivoting from the middle of the piece. The fork was attached to either side of the stock, the hook placed under the bowstring, and the lever pulled back to span the crossbow. With this mechanism, a crossbowman could get off as many as 5 shots a minute. Large crossbows had appeared as early as the 11th century, used in sieges and naval warfare. These were so heavy that they had to be rested upon a rampart or a ship's gunwale. By the 13th century, they were mounted with composite laths. The battlements were mounted with a portable spanning stand. It consisted of an L-shaped base, with a wheel pivoting at the end of the vertical line, and a handle allowing the wheel to be pulled down. The other end of the wheel had a belt with a pair of hooks. The siege crossbow was placed against the stand, the hooks secured under the bowstring, and the handle pulled. This allowed multiple defenders to rapidly load their siege crossbows. The siege crossbow was essentially a sniper's weapon, intended to hit targets at incredible distances. They were mounted at the tops of towers to give them a better sight, vantage, and defense against counterattacks. Reloading and shooting a crossbow was tricky business, especially when arrows, stones, and enemy bolts rained around you. It was much safer behind a castle wall, not so much in the open field. The solution was the pavise, a large, square shield, with one or two leaning legs that allowed it to stand upright, giving cover to the crossbowman as he reloaded. It was most likely invented in the 14th century in the city of Pavia, Italy, renowned for its crossbowmen. The drawback of the pavise was its weight, was it could be comfortably carried on shorter distances, like around a battlefield. For longer marches, it had to be put on the baggage train. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, the French leaders had not the patience to wait for the train, and forced their mercenary crossbowmen to take to the field without them. The mercs were outranged and defenseless against the English longbowmen. Better spanning methods led to even better laths in the 15th century, culminating in the steel prod. First appearing in 1316, when an experimental version was stolen from Matilda of Brabant. They had become commonplace by the middle of the century, and reached their height at the end, when they could achieve a draw weight of up to 1,500 pounds, an insane improvement over the early medieval crossbow. The mail hauberk or lamellar suit was no longer enough to protect its defender, leading to a rapid development of plate armor in the late Middle Ages. Armorers would impress potential buyers by proofing the armor, that is, shooting it with a crossbow at close range to prove its quality, marked by a distinct dimple where the bolt had struck. New mechanisms were needed to span these metal monstrosities. Pulleys were added to the windlass. Most advanced was the craniquin, first recorded in 1373. It consisted of a geared winding block that traveled along a toothed ratchet bar. The block was attached to the crossbow and the hook at the end of the bar to the bowstring. The handle was then spun to wind the block back and span the bow. This device demanded precision engineering and was highly expensive. Mechanisms like the goat's foot and craniquin allowed the shooter to load his weapon from horseback, leading to the rise of mounted crossbowmen. They have existed in some regards throughout history. The Chinese used crossbows from their chariots, and some documentation hints to Roman cavalry using the arqueballista. Mounted crossbowmen appear in medieval Europe as early as the 12th century, but they only really used horses to transport themselves between garrisons and battlefields. The craniquin was slow to use on horseback and mostly favored by hunters. The goat's foot was more common and recommended as late as 1590, when Sir John Smith recommended that riders should use crossbows instead of pistols, since pistoliers would always spill their powder. The Mamluks were especially fond of mounted crossbowmen, and would use a special type of crossbow with a very long tiller. Interestingly, some appear to have used the belt and claw and a complicated technique, where they kept the belt over their shoulder and bent forward in the saddle to span the crossbow while at gallop. This technique might have seen limited use by European cavalry as well. The final reloading mechanism was the vise or screw, a nowadays obscure spanner but very common in the late Middle Ages, both for siege crossbows and personal ones. It was either detachable or worked into the crossbow itself, and was quite simple. It was just a screw with a handle at one end and a hook on the other. The hook was secured to the bowstring and the handle turned until the bow had been spanned back to the nut. The drawback of the screw was that it must have been slow to use. By the end of the 16th century, the arms race between the crossbow and plate armor had reached its end, with plate armor coming out the victor. It was becoming increasingly difficult for even the heaviest of steel arbalests to pierce armor, and the heavy crossbows with their clunky mechanisms became cumbersome. It was really the advent of gunpowder that put an end to the crossbow as a military weapon. By 1482, the average handgun could pierce even the best of armor, while only costing half as much to produce as a steel-laughed crossbow. Furthermore, the production cost of gunpowder had shrunk drastically, and lead bullets were cheaper to cast than the manufacture of bolts. However, the crossbow would retain an honorable status as a sporting and hunting weapon. Urban crossbow fraternities became incredibly popular starting in the early 13th century, many surviving to the present day. They primarily consisted of craftsmen, many of whom signed up as soldiers, but also consisted of wealthy burghers, receiving the patronage of nobles and princes. During holidays, especially the celebrations of saints, the guild would hold processions led by singing boys, the men carrying banners, marching to the guild house where they would drink, feast, shoot the shit and shoot crossbows. The target was often some type of artificial bird, with the winner receiving a delectable prize, often a necklace with the bird in silver. By the 16th century, some guilds allowed the shooters to use firearms. Certain improvements were still made on military crossbows in the 16th century. One of the most romantic developments is the so-called assassin's crossbow, a name never used in the period. The Italians called it balestrino, meaning small crossbow. This was essentially a crossbow in pistol form, spanned with an internal mechanism. They were entirely made of steel and surprisingly powerful, even if limited to close range. However, there's no documented practical use of them, no assassinations or such, so it might just have been a toy for the inner child of some nobleman. More serious was the latchet, a small crossbow with a draw weight of about 200 pounds, developed in the tenuous borderland between England and Scotland. They had a built-in spanning mechanism, allowing them to be loaded simply and quickly, and the thumb trigger on the top of the tiller allowed it to be shot by a single hand, making it an excellent cavalry weapon. Indeed, it was favored by the ravers, marauders and cattle thieves, who launched rapid strikes across the border. The humid climate of the swamplands often rendered gunpowder weapons useless, forcing the ravers to rely on this weapon instead. But the crossbow saw its most practical use in hunting, arguably being the superior hunting arm up until the 19th century development of industrial firearms. It seems we have kind of come full circle by now. In the beginning we discussed how the crossbow seems to have initially been used as a hunting weapon, before seeing periods of military use, but always returning to its original roots. The crossbow had quite a few advantages over the firearm in terms of hunting. The firearm had better velocity and was easier to aim, but the crossbow bolt traveled more predictably than bullets fired from smoothbore muskets, and the crossbow produced less noise, even if the animals would easily pick up the slightest of sound, unless if you had the wind against you. However, crossbow bolts could be recycled and retrieved by hunting dogs. It would also do less damage to skins or the animal itself. Blunt arrows were designed specifically for shooting small birds, who would be obliterated by a firearm. The phrase, "to kill two birds with one stone," comes to mind, and even though we might only hit a single bird, or none at all, the stone bow was a natural development of the blunt quarrel, being essentially the bastard child of the crossbow and slingshot. The front of the stock was typically arched downwards, and it was designed to shoot bullets or stones at small game. Europeans would introduce the crossbow abroad, where it was likewise adopted for hunting in Africa and even the Americas. Native Americans like the Rappahannock used a simple type of crossbow, where the string was manually released by pressing it out of its notch with the thumb. The crossbow would increasingly turn into a hunting weapon of the aristocracy. These were intricately decorated. It saw some limited practical use among special forces in recent times, being used to deploy zip lines or grappling hooks. In World War I, it was used to shoot grenades into enemy trenches. Otherwise, it has largely faded into the annals of history.